Come on, just one more drink. You know I'm good for it. The bartender looked at me evenly. His dark eyes slitted as he tried to hide his frustration. I know no such thing. You still got money on your books from last week, and you dare to come in here flaunting your wealth? I was a fool to let you drink before you'd settled your tab. Now get out. The other drunks at the bar laughed, egging the bartender on as he crossed his arms. I wanted to argue, but the man was quite a bit larger than me, and I realized the futility of continuing. He would win, just as everyone did when they went up against me, so I hung my head and mumbled something about leaving. As I stepped into the cold winter air, I felt some of my buzz deteriorate, the derision of my drinking companions following me out into the chill weather. I was too drunk to be walking home, but it was my only means of conveyance. I live in Osaka, at least I did at the time, back in the early 2000s. I was not what you would call a solid citizen. I believe the word most of my culture uses for people like me is a NEET. It basically means I wasn't enrolled in school, wasn't working on a family, and I wasn't working in a job. I'd never been very diligent a worker or a very good student. The jobs I'd had were, well, menial, and often didn't last longer than a month or two. My grades had been good enough to get me into several very expensive cram schools, but not into college. With no real prospects, I'd settled into my life as a nobody. My parents paid for a cheap one-bedroom apartment in a part of town where you had to step over the winos as they stumbled home, and they sent me money to avoid having me come to the house and bring shame on them. I didn't care. All my money went to booze or even less lofty pursuits, and I was essentially circling the drain. I suppose fate had another plan, though, because that was when I met a very special woman on my way home. I had been celebrating a small victory that night, but it seems that my luck had run out. I had a little extra money after my raffle ticket had brought a small windfall, and I'd been buying drinks for a few of the barflies in an effort to get some female companionship that evening. They had taken my drinks and laughed at my jokes, but when the money was gone, so were they. I'd drunk up all my extra money, and after having no luck mooching drinks from the usual bar patrons, I was forced to head home. It was early December, and the snow on the ground was only an inch or two. The black ice glistened treacherously from the damp pavement, and I was trying my best not to weave too much as the bracing air took some of my buzz with it. The streets were mostly deserted, a few late-night pedestrians here and there, and the lights were far from seasonal. We don't really celebrate Christmas in Japan, not like the Americans do, and the lights here were usually from billboards or the advertisements that lit the night as well as the street lamps. I had turned a corner, heading from the trendy part of town I'd been drinking in into the less savory areas where I lived, when I first saw her. I stopped for a moment, not quite believing what I was seeing. It was a youngish woman, her black hair blowing in the wind, and her bare feet walking delicately atop the snow. She was dressed in some kind of robe, a wrapper too light for the weather, and I followed behind her as I tried to find the courage to speak to her. If she was out here and so little on a night like this, then she had to be as drunk as I was. Either that or on some kind of drug, but neither of that mattered much to me. There was heat in my apartment, and a little beer in the fridge. We could get warm together, maybe have a little drink, and watch the sun come up over the edge of my balcony. In her current state, I had little doubt that she'd be glad for a warm place to stay, and as I quickened my pace to come even with her, I tried to find my best opening gambit. "Good evening, beautiful. What's a flower like you doing out in the snow?" Now that we were even with each other, I could see her better. Her skin was as perfect as a china doll, her complexion smooth as porcelain, and her color as pale as milk. Her eyes were small and dark, focused ahead as she made her way towards wherever she was going, and it almost seemed like she was ignoring me. That was nothing new, Women often pretended they couldn't see me, but it was the little glances that kept me invested. She kept glancing at me with this coquettish look, favoring me with these intriguing lifts of her lips, and they kept me interested. "Aren't you cold? I know somewhere you can come to warm up. Your feet must be freezing." We were about 5 or 6 blocks away from my apartment, and she seemed to be heading in that direction anyway. I thought my luck might be turning around. The two of us kept walking, me chatting away as she glided across the icy sidewalk. She seemed immune to the black ice that sometimes tripped me up, and I began to notice how smoothly she moved. I know that sounds a little strange, but she moved as if her feet never touched the ground. It was like watching someone operate an extremely lifelike puppet, but it only seemed odd through the lens of memories. At the time, I was just a drunk and slightly amorous male who was hoping to trick this clearly intoxicated woman back to his apartment. I'm not the hero of this story. That should be pretty obvious. "What's your name?" I asked, realizing I didn't even know what her name was, but all I got in return was the same sly side-eye. Her face was utterly emotionless until she glanced at me and smirked. She seemed to know how to keep me interested, and I had become less flustered by the wind the longer we walked. I felt myself slowing to match her pace, my wet socks and cold feet no longer bothering me, and as we turned onto a familiar street, I realized we were about 2 blocks from my apartment. I could even see my window from here, the buttery yellow light spilling out onto the street through the dirty windows of the sliding door, and I smiled as I thought about how the sun would look as it came up through that pallid portal. When she turned suddenly, I almost missed it. We were nearly there, the front gate to my apartment complex, less than 20 steps up the road, and she had suddenly glided into the space between 2 buildings. The alley was a known haunt for winos and bums, and I found myself standing at the entrance as I watched her stroll into the semi-darkness. She'd captured me effortlessly, and when she spun preternaturally in the low light and crooked a finger at me, I was taking that first step before I could stop myself. Luckily for me, the black ice got me before she did. I slipped, falling on my butt, and as the cold rushed over me, I sobered a little. That was how I noticed that, despite the snow in the alley being deep enough to cover the first 3 inches of the garbage can or the dumpster that was there, she hadn't left a single footprint in the snow. I looked back and saw that the only footprints back the way we had come were mine, and that was when something hung in my booze-soaked brain. "Beware the Yuki-onna, my son," my mother had told me when I was very young. "Be careful that she doesn't get you while you're out in the snow." I had stopped on my way out the door, my sled under my arm and my boots unmarked by moisture as of yet, and asked her what that was. Yuki-onna sometimes hunt handsome men and try to take their life force. It stalks them through the snow, luring them away so it can get them alone, and freezes them in place as it draws out their precious life energy. So if a beautiful woman tries to take you away, come home quick and tell me so I can scare her off. She had said it jokingly, but as I sat in the snow, I realized I was about to do exactly what she had warned me against. The porcelain woman, the woman I now noticed left no trace behind, crooked a finger at me again, but I was up and running before it could waggle more than once. Fortune was with me, and I didn't find another puddle of ice until I reached the stoop of my apartment. I could hear her behind me, her scream the roar of a winter wind, and as I rounded the gate, I came into the courtyard and expected to be pounced on at any minute. It would serve me right, I realized, as I came shakily up the steps of the front porch. I had thought I was the hunter, seeking my prey to lure it home, but I'd been tricked and ran afoul of a much larger beast. I stumbled on the ice near the door, fumbling my key from my pocket, and as I looked up, I saw her reflected in the glass. Her hair was no longer straight, writhing behind her as it rose like a nest of vipers. The wrapper now looked more like a funeral shroud, the edges tattered and dark with grave soil. Her dark eyes were now large and round, their centers full of terrible knowledge, and her jaw was opened much too wide as I slammed the key into the lock and rushed inside. I shoved the door closed behind me, expecting a loud bang as she barreled through it, but when I turned to look from the stairs, the courtyard was empty, save for the snowdrifts. I drank the beer in my fridge alone that night, realizing how close I had come to death, and deciding that it was time to make a change. I called my mother the next day and told her I needed help. That was 20 years ago, and my nights of midnight carousing are behind me. I went to cram school, got my test scores up, and started college. I now work as an engineer. My wife and I met in college, and we got married after she finished her doctorate. We have an apartment in a much better part of town, a son getting ready for high school, and my current life is as far from that apartment where I saw the snow woman as night is from day. I no longer depend on my parents, and I've left the rut that I wallowed in for far too long behind me. I still go out drinking with my coworkers sometimes, but now I'm careful how much I have before making my way home. On the night I barely escaped death, 2 homeless men were found frozen to death in that very alley. The news believed that they had succumbed to the elements, but I think the Yuki Onna was simply looking for a third course in its long meal. Some nights, when the snow falls and the leaves drift on the sidewalk, I sit in my apartment and just wonder if it's still out there, hunting the streets of Osaka for its next meal. Then I remember how lucky I am to have escaped the cold embrace of the Yuki Onna. I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my 2nd week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories. That's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvin Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night, where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness, and as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her. I'm not proud of it, but when you receive one of those calls about your car's extended warranty, it's sometimes me. I'm a writer, a published writer, with an agent, a bestseller, and everything. 5 years ago, I was number 3 on several bestseller lists. 5 years ago, Oprah featured my book on her book list. 5 years ago, I sat on Ellen DeGeneres and promoted the crap out of my book, a move that netted me the house I now live in. It was a good year for me, and when my agent suggested that I write a sequel, I jumped at the chance. 5 years later, my sequel is finally coming together, but the bills don't stop just because your royalties and your residuals stop rolling in. My wife went back to her job at the grocery store, something to help pay the bills while I was working on my book, but it just wasn't enough. We had lived a little too grandly for the last 4 years, and now the money was gone. I told her I was paying the bills out of the residuals, but in reality, it was the salary I made working call center jobs like this one. Call center jobs are pretty easy, all things considered. You read a script, you call gullible people and offer them goods and services. You rake in little bonuses when you manage to trick the old or the infirm. It also allows me to work from home so I can proofread pages and research chapters while I cold call people in my pajamas. You get a lot of hate, a lot of people playing games, but that kind of thing is easy to ignore. Hell, I did retail for 8 years when I was young, and it's given me a pretty thick skin. It was easy to ignore when you realized that whether you made the sale or not, you were still going to receive a check at the end of the week. It was a pretty good gig, until I cold called someone I shouldn't have. The voice that picked up the phone was deep, cultured, and I should have known that it wasn't a voice of someone that could be fooled with such a cheap trick. He was the last number on my sheet for the day, and I figured I had nothing to lose. Yes, Sarah, I'm calling you about your car's extended warranty. Do you still own the 2013 Link? Does this ever actually work? I stumbled for a moment, choosing to roll on with the script rather than break character. Lincoln, the warranty is nearing its expiration, and we're offering select customers a... This is the 5th call I've received from your company today, young man. I started to ignore it, like I'd ignored the others, but I figured I'd pick up this time and see what was so important. I see now that the answer was nothing. I tried to stay in character, but it was hard in the face of his frank honesty. Look, I'm just doing my job, sir. I've got bills to pay and a family to feed, same as you. If you aren't interested, then I'll... Oh, a family man! Is that why you take the elderly for their pensions and scam the mentally handicapped for their hard-earned money? Such a provider. I'm sure your children would be proud of their father. He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I almost didn't register it as an insult. I could have hung up on him. He wasn't the worst offender I'd had all day. But something about his voice rankled me. Where did this guy get off? He was going to sit here and tell me how rotten it was to make my money this way, like I didn't already know? Where the heck did he get off? Look, buddy, there's no reason for any of that. We're just calling to let you know about your warranty program. If you don't want it, then I'll just... He cut me off again. Don't worry about it, friend. I'm sure you'll have more prevalent things to worry about soon enough. Ciao. The line went dead then, and the silence seemed ominous. I sat the phone down like I thought it might blow up. I'd been threatened on the phone before, but this one felt different. There'd been no screaming, no cursing, no invitations to screw myself, or questions about how I slept at night. I shuddered a little, suddenly feeling like a goose had walked over my grave. I jumped a little when I saw my son standing in the doorway, scratching his neck. Michael had wandered into my office while I was on the phone. I turned to him as he stood scratching, his hand moving up and down his back, before asking if he was okay. He'd been napping, something he would have to give up when he started school next year, and it seemed that his itchy back had woken him slightly ahead of schedule. "Daddy, my back is so itchy." I told him to go lay in bed while I grabbed the cream and the lotion. His mother and I called it Triceratops cream, something that always made Michael laugh, and it seemed to be the only thing that helped with his eczema when it got really bad. It's something he suffered with since he was very young. We've had to wash his clothes with dye-free detergent, use special soap during his baths, and stay far away from things like wool. So I grabbed the cream and the lotion so I could lather him up and bring his itching to an end. As I slid his shirt off, however, I worried there might be something else going on here. Michael's back was covered in boils. A swath of small pustules with white heads were scattered over his pink skin, and they looked like pimples. There were clusters of small patches, islands of blight on a sea of normal skin, and I was honestly a little afraid to touch them. Nevertheless, I mixed the cream together and rubbed them onto his back, feeling him jump as some of the boils burst beneath my fingers. He seemed to relax when I finished, thanking me as he slid his shirt down gingerly. That was how it started. I wish I could say that was where it ended. I was proofing pages when my daughter, Michelle, arrived home from school. She stumbled into my office, her hands scratching at the back of her neck absent-mindedly, as she hugged me and told me about her day. We'd done this ever since her first day of school, and it was one of her daily rituals. She'd taken a test she believed she'd done well on, found $1 in the storm grate near the house, and told Jenny that she was being mean to Sara, so the two were no longer friends. I listened to her in a detached way, nodding and mm-hmming as she talked, noticing her scratching her neck a couple of times. The scratching didn't seem peculiar. People scratch sometimes, but I couldn't help but notice the red patch of skin on the back of her neck as she left to go start her homework. I turned back to my work, but sighed as I noticed the time. I saved my work and locked my computer. I had hardly gotten through half the chapter I was working on, but it was time to get started on dinner before my wife got home. The pork chops were cooking in the air fryer when my wife came through the door. I smiled as I turned to pull her against me, kissing the top of her head as she leaned warmly into me. She shuddered a little as my hands touched her back, but said it was just some back pain from standing all day. Mary called out again, so I was the only one working the register. Again. It was 8 straight hours of standing behind the register, listening to people complain. "How'd your book proofing go today?" I turned away from her, pretending to stir the potatoes as I answered. Stephanie could always tell when I was lying. Pretty good. Lots of progress. I'm sure it'll be ready for my agent in a few weeks." "That's fantastic, dear. I'm sure it will be as much of a hit as your last one," she said, pressing a kiss on my stubbly cheek. I smiled, but I really wasn't so sure. It all came down to this latest book, it seemed. I just had to finish my book. I just had to write another hit. I just had to find my way back onto the bestseller list and get myself out of Dutch. Easy, right? The next morning, I awoke determined to get some work done today. I would make up for my lack of work the day before and end with some real progress. I still had over 200 pages to proof, and if I didn't get them done fairly quickly, there would be no time to send them off, and quite likely I'd have to sit through notes on a second draft. As I went to wake my daughter up for school, however, I heard the hoarse cough coming from my son's room. I cracked the door to find him lying on his stomach, his shirt off and his back worse than the day before. His skin was broken out in red, angry boils, and the small white-headed blemishes of the day before had become larger and redder, their tips filled with translucent pus. He was softly moaning, his eyes begging for me to make the pain stop as they pulsated. My wife came out of the bedroom then, getting ready for work, and saw Michael's back. She ran to him, careful not to touch any of the spots, and asked me if he'd had these since yesterday. He was broken out, I said honestly, startled by the sudden appearance of the large angry boils, but it wasn't this bad. I put on lotion and cream, and he seemed to feel a lot better. Stephanie started talking quietly to herself, mostly arguing with herself about whether she could find someone to cover for her, but I told her I could take Michael to the pediatrician. Heck, what was the point of being a stay-at-home husband if I couldn't take my son to the doctor? She asked if I was sure. She knew I had work to do today, but I told her that it was nothing. I told her to go to work and that I would handle things here. I told Michael to stay in bed, not wanting him to aggravate any of the blisters he had on his back, and went to go wake Michelle up so she didn't miss her bus. I was in for another surprise when I got to her room. I opened her door and was immediately buffeted by the sound of her racking cough and her low groans from the bed. She was warm to the touch, not overly so, but definitely fevered, and I asked how she was feeling. She said it felt like she had the flu. Her throat hurt, she was hot, and her whole body ached. My wife was getting ready by then, stepping into the shower before she stepped into her uniform, and I figured it would be just as easy to make an appointment for 2 kids as it would for 1. I told Michelle to get some clothes on, and that I would make an appointment for her and Michael. With all the COVID paranoia still floating around, it was pretty easy to get an appointment last minute with the symptoms they were presenting. 1 phone call to an after-hours nurse later, and I prepared to trade all my editing and proofreading time before work for time spent sitting in the car until it was our turn to go to the back. It was an hour and a half before we made it in, and I tried to make the most of it by doing some edits on my phone. It was slow and tedious, the 2 of them glued to their phones or their gadgets in the back seat as they hacked and coughed, but I managed to get a little bit of work done before they sent me a text saying they were ready for us in the back. 30 minutes later, their pediatrician came back with very little by way of an explanation. Well, they don't have COVID, or the flu, or anything else that I can test for here. What they do have is a high fever, a very wet cough, and troubling boils all over their back. Michelle too, I asked, having not been aware that she was sporting boils as well. Michelle too, she confirmed. Her outbreak isn't as bad as Michael's, but it's getting worse. I'd recommend that you keep them at home until it clears up. Don't touch the sores with your bare hands, and if you happen to by accident, be sure to disinfect your hands with alcohol. Wear gloves and a mask when you interact with them, and go to the hospital if you or your wife start presenting symptoms. I'm hoping it clears up on its own, but if it doesn't in a day or 2, you should take them to the hospital anyway. I bundled them back into the car, a handful of prescriptions in my pocket, and called my wife as I went about getting their medications and getting them home. All of this, the meds, the visit, everything, was going to cost some, and I needed to get them settled so I could log some hours at work. My wife's insurance wasn't very good, and the money I made would be crucial if I wanted to get out of debt. I also had to find some time to work on my book, knowing in the back of my mind that it was the secret to solving my current problems. Stephanie picked up on the 3rd ring, and the cough she rumbled into the phone sounded suspiciously like the ones from the back seat. She swore it was just allergies, and commiserated with me about the diagnosis. She wished she could be there, but said that she would likely be late this evening. Mary had called out, again, and she was the only one working register today. It was noon before I got everyone medicated, set up in their rooms with lunch and toys and entertainment, and sat down at my computer so I could begin my day. As I took calls and proofed pages, I felt a little bubble of anxiety every time someone picked up the phone. I was still a little rattled by yesterday's call, but all of my calls today seemed normal enough. I actually had 2 people give me their information and buy one of the garbage warranties we offered. I had no idea whether they worked or not, but the company was paying me to make calls, not research their products. In between calls, I peeked in on the kids to make sure they were okay. Michael spent most of the day sleeping, his breath heavy and wet, and Michelle just looked at me whenever I peeked in on her, seeming listless and barely there. I gave them more meds and made sure they had juice and liquids, and kept an eye on their temperatures as I took calls in between my nursing duties. As the sun set, I began to get worried about my wife. She should have been home by now, should have been home a half an hour ago, and I was just about to call her when I heard the door pop loudly open. She was laid out on the floor of the living room, her coughs deep and wet, her own blemishes peeking from the collar of her work shirt. I took them all to the hospital then, just bundled them into the car and went. The ER didn't know what to make of them, but we've all been quarantined upstairs now as I try to figure out why I haven't gotten sick with the same symptoms as the rest of my family. They are working hard to manage their fevers. All 3 of them are around 103, and they're laid out on their stomachs as their boils have become very fragile. They're afraid that popping them might lead to sepsis, but the longer I look at them, the more intrigued by them I become. I've been sitting in the room for the last few hours, my only company the beeping of their machines, and as I sat next to my wife, I noticed something strange. The boils on her back seemed to be forming a pattern, the swoops almost looking like a picture. I sat stroking her hand, Stephanie groaning in and out of consciousness, and the longer I looked, the more I realized the swoops are words. Moving over to Michael, I can see he has similar words, all picked out in the pustulant boils that mark his baby-fine skin. I brought my phone out and snapped pictures of their backs, the 3 of them requiring a little turning and moving before the messages were visible. I'm sitting here now as I contemplate telling the doctor what I've found. I don't think it'll help, but I don't know what to make of it either. It can't be what I believe it is, but I can't think of any other explanation for the words that I'm reading swirled across the painful backs of my family. The message reads, "I've been trying to reach you about your car's extended warranty." Grandma and I have been roommates for about a year now. That probably sounds pretty weird for a 23-year-old girl to say, but I have to say it's been a pretty great arrangement. My girlfriend and I have lived in the apartment for about 3 years now, both of us deciding that campus housing wasn't for us. Grandma may be sort of a new arrival, but I gotta say, she's probably about the best roommate I've ever had. She cooks, she cleans, doing so despite Regina and I telling her that we don't expect her to, and our laundry always seems to find its way into the closet once the hamper is full. She was one of those hippie types who missed the 60s and is incredibly chill. I don't know many other grandmothers who like to sit on the back porch at night with us and have a beer and smoke a bowl. She doesn't judge me for what most people over 50 would consider an unnatural relationship either, which means the world to Regina and I. She told my girlfriend many times that she considers her a second granddaughter, and the people in the community tell me how cool it is to have someone like my grandma in our lives. Most nights, while we sit on the porch, having a beer or 2 and passing around some stuff that's not strictly legal here, Grandma would tell us how this reminds her of how she and her friends acted when they were young. My friends and I would sit on the veranda and drink wine sometimes. The nights in Greece are warm, and we used to just sit in our shifts and tease the boys when they came by. It was a marvelous time to grow up. The war was a distant memory, at least for those of us who were young, and life was full of possibilities. Grandma grew up in Greece, missing the end of the war by 3 years, and she often talked lovingly about her time there. She was never very clear about where she grew up, but it must have been near the water because many of her stories involved she and her friends swimming or going to the beach with boys they fancied. She'd met Grandpa at 17, him studying abroad and her waiting tables in a cafe. She said it had been love at first sight, and he'd asked her to marry him once his time in Greece was over. He brought me back to California with him, and to me, it was the grandest place in all the world. She often told us stories from when she was young, and Regina and I usually found ourselves laughing at the antics of her younger self. She and her friends had sounded less like a group of young girls and more like a group of street toughs. Grandma told us how they had done everything from teasing boys into fighting to stealing a scooter and fleeing from the police. If it hadn't been for Great Aunt Sophie and Uncle Martin, Grandma might have been a full-fledged criminal instead of a sometimes rapscallion. They had all been happy stories, at least until tonight. Regina had come home from work, and I could tell that something was off right away. Regina's in nursing school and often has to work in the ER as part of her studies. They pay them for their time, of course, but it's expected that students will pursue jobs in the medical field so they can gain experience. Regina is usually full of stories about how she helped clear the airway of a baby, or how she got a patient to tell her that the prescription drug they had taken was more recreational than they'd let on. Grandma and I had already started our little revel without her, and she took the beer I handed her with a shaky hand. I watched her sip it for a few seconds, hands jittering, before finally asking her what had happened. They brought in a lady today. She'd been stabbed over a dozen times, and they said she had no pulse. They wheeled her in on a gurney and asked if I'd notify the morgue that they had a Jane Doe to go back. I nodded. Not your first dead body, babe. Regina shook her head. I turned to get the phone, the paramedics walking away for a moment as a call came in over the radio, and when I turned back, the woman had sat up. It was a little scary, but I thought it was just gas in the corpse or something. I turned back to the phone, and then the gurney started creaking as she climbed off. She went walking up the hall like a ghost in her sheet, and when I started screaming, the paramedics came back in a hurry. It seemed funny to me, a lady in a sheet shuffling up the hallway towards freedom, but I guess it was a little different when you were living it. Turns out she had a very weak pulse, and when she'd come in, she'd attempted to run. Her heart stopped before she got to the door, and she died right there in the ambulance bay. How terrible, I said, my image less funny now. She must have been searching for her killer, just like poor old Victor, Grandma said, patting Regina on the arm. Who? I asked, not sure who this Victor was that Grandma was talking about. Victor Mustroff, she elaborated. He was a handsome young man in the village I grew up in. He was quite a bit older than me, around 22 when I was 13, but he was so handsome. It was a shame what happened to him, but it was even worse what happened afterwards. I leaned forward on the cheap plastic chair I was sitting on and asked her to tell us. She nodded. It's a little scary, though. At least, it gave me a shiver when I was young. As she spoke, her eyes seemed to cloud a little, her mind traveling back over the years and the miles. It all started after Victor's murder. They didn't realize it was a murder right away, of course. Poor old Victor was a carpenter, he and his brother Isaac. The two worked for his father, Marcus, but it was pretty clear who Marcus favored. Victor was set to take over his father's operation when his father grew too old to work, and Victor had let this and his charm go to his head. He was vain, we all knew it, but he was charming too, and his vanity was really no big deal. He dated many girls in the village, and my friends and I were even taken with him. Then, one day, he went missing. We all searched for him, the whole town coming together to look for a favored son. Isaac came with us, saying that his brother had left the job site after saying he had to go do something. We searched the woods and the hills and everywhere around the village, but we couldn't find his car or Victor. He was simply gone. A week went by with no sign of him, but most of us just assumed he had taken after some woman from out of town. Victor was prone to that sort of behavior, but this was the longest he had ever been gone. Isaac went right on working, like his older brother wasn't just gone. Marcus, however, was inconsolable. We saw him many evenings sitting on the porch, sot drunk and weeping openly. Isaac would often be trying to console him, but Marcus wanted nothing from that one. My friends and I changed sides of the street when we walked past Marcus's house, not wanting to get drawn into their arguments. Then, one night, someone said they saw something strange. I heard it around the market first. It was an older woman, someone's grandmother, who said they had been walking home when they encountered someone they thought was Victor. He was staggering on a badly twisted leg, kicking up dust from the cobbles with every shaky step. His clothes, however, looked like the kind of garments a dandy might wear. His vest was filthy. His pants left a trail of water when he walked. I called his name, thinking he might have been in an accident, and when he turned around, I thought for certain I would faint. The hair was wet and lank, the curtains seeming to spin in slow motion, and then I I could see the weeping crater that was his face. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and the holes where they had been did little but gurgle and wheeze. I screamed, turning away in my fright to clutch the edge of the fountain, and when I looked back, it was gone. I scoffed at her story as other old ladies clutched their rosaries and told her she was lucky to be alive. Old women often made things up like this, I thought in my youthful wisdom, and went back to shopping. It was likely just some beggar or a scarred-up vagrant. I told my friends about it that night as we sat smoking on my mother's veranda, and we all laughed at how silly she had been. When Julia saw him that night on her way home, it changed our outlook a bit. Julia was supposed to spend the night, but she ran home after dark to get something. She was gone for a little while, longer than I had thought she would be, and when she came back, she was out of breath and sweating, close to hyperventilating. It took us quite a while to calm her down, but finally she told us that she had seen the man from the old woman's story. It was just like she said, she gasped, her face fearful as she recalled it. I was going home to get my records, and when I came to the plaza near the fountain, I heard a weird dragging sound. He came out of an alley, and I turned to see his smushed face looking straight at me. I ran as fast as I could, but it seemed that no matter where I went, he was limping close by. Finally, I hid in the market until he shambled away, but I was terrified that he would find me. We consoled her, trying to keep her quiet so that she didn't disturb my parents with such talk, and eventually she went to sleep as her fear began to ebb. The strange, shambling man was all anyone could talk about in the coming days. People saw him walking through the streets, shambling along as though looking for someone. He would always be gone whenever a group came to see him, but the longer it lasted, the more people started traveling in groups. There was a lot of speculation about who it was and what they were after, and some people thought it might be Victor. Chief among them was Miss Treda, a woman believed to be a Strega. She claimed that Victor was seeking his killer, and wanted to find his body so that they could use cruentation to find him. She had conducted things like this before, offering to help the police if they would let her display the body, but she had been turned down many times. Cruentation was something old that she believed in, and it seemed to associate guilt with the blood coming from a dead body when the murderer touched it. No one really believed in it anymore. It was an ancient practice, and besides, how would you collect everyone up to touch the body? Our town was home to hundreds, and collecting them all would be quite an effort. Most people rolled their eyes at Miss Treda, but I think a lot of them secretly believed that the shambling specter was Victor. When it broke into Marcus's house and scared him half to death, many more people thought it might also be Victor. A few people whispered in the market the next day that the spirit had come after Marcus, and there were some rumblings about checking if he was the murderer. Miss Treda had started offering money to anyone who could find Victor's body. Some young men had started roving the streets at night to see if they could follow the specter back to his place of rest, but it seemed to avoid them as easily as it avoided the constables that hunted for it. This went on for several weeks, and it was very exciting times. People sat and made up wild rumors about the stranger and what it wanted, and my friends and I were no exception. Then one night it all came to an end. I remember being woken up by someone screaming. Our house wasn't too far from Isaac's house, and when I went to my window I could see the corpse as it carried him through the streets. It had him by the front of his shirt, Isaac beating at him as it carried him towards the plaza where he had first been seen. Others were looking out their windows, watching the grim procession as it made its way through the streets. Despite the horror, many of us put on our robes and shoes and ran to see where the shade was taking poor Isaac. As he came into the plaza, it was hard for the crowd to ignore the blood that was oozing from him, his pores excreting this thick and tarish juice. Miss Treda, standing amongst the crowd by then, didn't have to tell them what that meant. Isaac had already begun confessing his sin again and again for all to hear. Upon hearing him confess, it was as though the shade folded in on itself. He collapsed, dropping Isaac and laying dead on the cobbles of the plaza. The constables arrested him immediately, and I watched him beg for forgiveness as they hung him 3 months later. His lawyer drug out the proceedings, claiming that evidence provided by a corpse was not the modern justice that he was about, but the number of people who had heard him confess in the plaza was inarguable. Isaac himself pled guilty, despite his lawyer pleading for him to be silent, and he refused to leave jail until he was led to the gallows. I heard he told people that Victor's shade visited his window every night, and he was afraid to leave the jail, fearing it might come after him. 100 people saw Victor's corpse bleed that night, 100 or more at least, and they all lived in fear of the shade for nearly a month. That was thankfully the only time I saw a corpse walk. Regina and I looked at each other, both of us trying to see if the other really believed her. As I lay here now, Regina snoring thinly beside me, I can say that, whether I believe or not, it's a story that'll follow me for quite some time. This is Jay, Moody, and Kai, and today we're searching for Macaro House. The video was shot in shaky cam, the footage hard to watch without getting a little seasick. Officer Wiley, Detective Wiley now, had seen a lot in his time on the force, but a double homicide perpetrated by this 14-year-old kid in front of him was something he had hoped he would never see. A double homicide and carried out against his two best friends at that. The two kids in question, Marshall Moody and Kai Dillon, had been friends with Jason Weeks since elementary school, and there had never been any reports of violence or any other alarming behavior, at least not to the police. The boys had operated a YouTube channel, JMK Occult, for the last 2 years, and while their content was pretty typical for kids online, they had been uploading steadily every week since their first video about strange deer in the north woods around Catterley. Hell, Wiley realized, he had even watched some of their stuff when he was bored. People in the community knew them, and this was out of character for any of them. Wiley paused the video, the three boys blundering through the south woods and chatting like a pack of squirrels, before looking at Jason. Jason, Jay to his friends, looked like he had aged a decade. He had a gaunt look, usually reserved for soldiers who'd come back from war. His hair had been long and blonde for as long as anyone could remember, but the kid sitting there now was as bald as an egg, his scalp looking scoured instead of shaved. The shirt he had been wearing in the video was gone. He was still wearing the ring of it around his neck, the stretched fabric like a collar, and the jeans he wore were stained and ragged in places that looked fresh. He'd been found with no shoes or socks, but he was wearing the orange flip-flops that the jail residents often did. Wiley knew his parents wanted to bail him out, but he wasn't sure if the judge was going to extend him bail or not, given the nature of his crime. The way the two kids had been ripped apart was something that would haunt him for a long time. "So, Jason, Officer Russell tells me that somebody picked you up beside the road, and you told them that your friends were dead, and that you had killed them. Is that true?" Jason nodded, not speaking a word as he continued to stare at the wall. The woman in question was Darla Hughes, a mother of 3 who had stopped when she saw a young teenage boy walking on the side of the road in the current state he was in. Stories of kidnapping and kids held in basements for months while God knew what happened to them were clear in the public conscience. Darla thought she had found some kid who had escaped this situation, and when she stopped to help him, she said the poor lamb had said 8 words and then nothing else. He said, "My friends are dead, and I killed them." They had found the kids in the clearing in the woods about 3 miles in, a site Wiley was familiar with. How many times had he and his friends gone looking for Macaro House? Everyone in Catterley knew about Macaro House, and most people's childhood had been spent looking for it. John Macaro, a prominent figure in Catterley history, had been a prominent importer and exporter in England. He had come to America before the Revolutionary War to try and set up a similar business, and Catterley had been a large enough port to satisfy his needs, without being so busy that a new face would be lost. He established a manor in the South Woods, despite being told that it was Indian territory, and the bill of sale did very little to dispatch the native tribes that lived in the area. He survived 2 raids by the natives somehow, but his wife and daughter were not so lucky the second time. As such, he rallied a mob of townspeople to go into the woods to help him flush out the natives who were living there. The raid took weeks, but by the end, they had killed or scattered every member of the tribe that lived there. Satisfied, Mr. McElroy built his lavish estates, but strange things surrounded it from the beginning. Workers went missing, people reported strange lights and sounds after dark, and a shriveled figure in skins and feathers could be seen lurking after moonrise. Animals on the property acted strangely, and sometimes people found wolves or bears on the grounds. Usually, they were in a rage, but sometimes they simply fled as if they had been drawn there and weren't sure what to do now that they were. Once the house was finished, John McElroy had a hard time keeping staff. None of the hands he had tried to hire to keep his livestock would stay more than a week, and they all refused to stay on the property after dark. His servants would likewise disappear suddenly, and none of them would stay at night besides his butler, who had been with him for years. People said that Mr. McElroy talked about hearing chanting in the house and seeing strange shadows, and when even his butler disappeared one evening, John locked the doors and stayed in the house alone for a long time. People who came to see him said that he could be seen wandering the halls like a ghost, calling out for people that only he could see. When his mansion was seen in full blaze one night, those who were first on the scene said they saw a lone man silhouetted in the flames, his feathers and skins on full display. He disappeared when they got close, but he had been seen by many in the years to come. "What did you see out there, Jason?" Jason continued to stare at the wall. "I want to help you, kid, but you have to help yourself first." He couldn't help but glance down at the kid's fingers as he let them splay out on the table like sleeping spiders. The nails were dirty, the beds crusty with something like blood, and several of them were torn and ragged. There was grime around his mouth, too, and Wiley would have bet his next paycheck that it wasn't Kool-Aid. It looked like mud or paint, but it was probably blood. Jason remained silent as the grave. "Jason, none of us believe you killed your friends. You're wrong." Wiley had been fiddling with the remote, trying not to look at the kid's hands, but when he spoke, he looked up. Jason was still staring at the wall, but his head was shaking as his teeth chattered together. The kid looked like he was staring into the mouth of hell instead of the cream-colored walls of the interrogation room. Wiley almost didn't want to ask him what he had seen, but he needed to know. He needed to know how this kid had killed 2 other kids, one of whom was a head taller than him and outweighed him by 60 pounds. "Would you like to elaborate?" Wiley asked. He didn't think the kid would for a moment, but finally he just reached slowly and pushed play on the remote. He kept looking at Wiley like he thought he might slap his hand, but when he let him go all the way across the table unsmacked, he relaxed a little. The video went on as they walked through the woods, joking and laughing as the woods lived their quiet existence around them. "We went in at 8, just after Kai's mom went to work. She wouldn't have liked us going into the South Woods. Wanted to investigate McElroy House. We wanted to do it for our first episode, but Moody said it was something we should work up to. The McElroy House was something big. We needed to be ready for it. Turned out we weren't." On the screen, the kids kept walking through the woods, checking their compass and making their careful way through the thick brush. They were still chattering, talking about what they might find when they got there, and whether they would find the clearing or see the mysterious mansion that people talked about sometimes. Legends said that a ghostly manor appeared in the clearing sometimes, the ghost of the house that the people had seen go up in flames. Wiley didn't believe that, but as a kid, he had to admit that the clearing where the house had been was spooky. All the wood had rotted away long ago, the stones taken away for use in other things, but the land felt wrong. Wiley had never been there after dark, but people claimed to hear footsteps and see things after the sun went down. Wiley pushed fast forward on the tape and watched as the kids plodded on and on. Jason wished that he could have sped through that part of the trip. They had set out at 8, waving to Kai's mom as she pulled out of the driveway. The packs had been pulled out of the garage after she was down the road a piece, and the three set out for the woods. They knew the rough direction of McGhee House, but no one really came upon it the same way. Danny Foster had said it was a 3-mile walk from the forest's edge to the property, but Jamie had claimed that he and his friends had walked for what seemed like hours. "When we found it, though," he said, "we found the house instead of an empty lot. We kept daring each other to go in, but we left when someone lit a fire on the grounds." Jason and his friends were hoping to find the house instead. And as their walk turned into a hike, Kyle stopped and looked at the compass. "We should have gotten there by now." Moody chuckled. "Maybe we're going in the wrong direction." "Can't be," Kai protested. "The directions are to go south into the south woods for 3 miles. Then you'll come to the clearing where McGhee House sits." Jason hadn't wanted to jinx it, but at the time, he thought that boded well for them finding the house. They kept walking, Kai good for an endless stream of conversation, and as the sun began to set, Jason found that he was out of breath. His tongue felt like leather as it stuck to the roof of his mouth, and the lunch they had brought had been eaten hours ago. Moody had argued that they should turn around and head back, but Jason had finally vocalized that this could mean they were going to find the house instead of an empty lot. He was hopeful, right up until they got what they wanted. When the sun went down, Wiley knit his brows together. "I thought you and your friends were only in the woods for a few hours." Jason shook his head slowly. "We were, and we weren't. The time on the camera says we walked for 8 hours before I turned it off, but when I got picked up by the side of the road, it was barely noon." Wiley pursed his lips. How was that possible? The video cut out, the battery in the camera having been exhausted, and Jason nodded at the screen. "Those batteries have a max life of 3 hours. Dad said it was the best battery they had when he ordered it for me, and it was pretty expensive. There's no way one of those batteries could have recorded for 8 hours, but it did." The recording came back on, and Wiley was shocked to see that they were standing on the lawn of an old Gothic mansion. The sun setting behind the house made a perfect backdrop for the shot, and the boys were oohing and ahhing appreciatively. None of them seemed to believe what they were seeing, the whole thing a little otherworldly, and they seemed to be having some kind of argument about who was going to approach the house first. "Is that it?" Wiley stopped to wet his lips. "It can't be. The McGhee house burned down hundreds of years ago." "But there it is," Jason said, his eyes still fixed on the wall, "in all its glory." And oh, what glory there had been in it. Moody had gawped at the house as if he had never seen one before. "No way. There's no way." "That's impossible," Kyle breathed. "That house burned to the ground before our fathers' fathers were even thought of." "But there it is," Jason said, mirroring his later statement, though he could not have known it, "in all its glory." As the sun set behind it, Jason thought it looked even spookier than it would at night. The mansion rose like an obelisk towards the sky, its towering roofs looking naked without flags or pinions. The boys stood at the edge, trying to shame or bluster one another into going into there first, but in the end, Jason took the first step. The others looked surprised at his boldness, but They followed closely after, not wanting to be thought less of. Jason expected the house to disintegrate as he approached, an illusion or a trick of the light. But as his foot came to rest on the boards of the old house, he felt their solidity and continued to climb. When the door opened for them, the broad double doors swinging jauntily on their hinges, the three boys pulled back as if preparing to run. The camera captured their indecision, the doors yawning wide as if waiting to receive them. Jason seemed to surprise even himself as he came forward to investigate. Wait, what if it's a trap? This whole place shouldn't even exist. If you think I'm going to pass up a chance to explore it, you're wrong. Jason went in, pausing just inside the doors as if expecting them to crash shut. When they didn't, Moody followed him, and Kai brought up the rear. Macaro House lived up to its gothic exterior, the inside full of soft, dark velvet and antique furniture. There was a fire burning in the hearth inside the sitting room, tables spread with books in the library, and as they came up the long hall that led towards what was undoubtedly a dining room, Jason began to smell something. It was something like a stew or maybe a roast, and the smell of meat brought them to the dining room. A long table sat in the middle, 8 chairs on each side of it, and at the end sat a wrinkled old man eating soup from a bowl. It was hard to tell before they got close, but the old man looked like he might have been Native American. He was dressed in hides, feathers adorning his head and necklace, and he wore a beaded necklace with bones and claws on it. He looked up as they approached, glowering at them evenly, before returning to his meal. He ignored the boys, all 3 standing back apprehensively, before Jason found the courage to speak. "Excuse me, sir, is this your house?" The spoon froze on its way to his mouth, and the old man looked like he had been slapped. "My house?" he asked, his voice sounding thin and whispery. "No, child, but it was paid for by my people. We paid with our blood. We paid with our lives, and in the end the cost was high. I took some of that cost from the previous owner of this home, and now it's only me who lives here." Kai made an uncomfortable noise in his throat, like a dog trying to tell its owner that something wasn't safe, and Jason understood the feeling. "Well, we'll leave you to it then. We didn't mean to." "Leave?" The old man sounded amused. "Oh, no. No one leaves Macaro House, not until they've played the game. It was always a way for our warriors to test their mettle, and I have so longed to see it played again. Will you join me? If not, I'm afraid you might find it quite hard to leave." Moody took a step back, and Jason heard his footsteps on the carpet as he tried to retreat. "What's the game?" Jason asked, figuring they could outrun the old coyote if it came down to it. Jason wondered why he had thought of him that way, but he didn't have time to ponder it then. "Choose your piece from my necklace," the old man said, slipping it off and laying it on the table. "Claw, talon, or fang." "Then what?" Moody asked, Kai moving behind him as if afraid to come too close. "Then we start the game," the old man said, smiling toothily. For an old man, he certainly had a lot of sharp teeth. "Okay," Moody said, walking forward as Kai followed in his wake. "I choose the claw." "Talon," Kai said, reaching out to touch it. "Fang," Jason said, and put his hand out. He felt a sudden, violent shifting in his guts. He was shrinking, the world moving rapidly all around him. He was smaller, but was more than he was, and he was trapped. His legs scrambled at things that held him, and he tore it to pieces as he freed himself. He heard a loud roar and something big rose up before him. The bear was massive, ragged bits of something hanging from him, and Jason was afraid that he would kill him before he could get truly free of the snare. Something screeched then, flying at the bear's face and attacking him. Jason saw blood run down the snout of the bear as it tried to get the bird or hawk or whatever it was off its face. Jason circled and looked for an opening. He was low, on all fours, and he could smell the hot blood as it coursed down the bear's muzzle. Blood and meat and fear and desire mingled in him, and as something laughed, he turned and saw a large coyote sitting at the table. Its grin was huge, its snout longer than any snout had a right to be, and he was laughing in a strange half-animal, half-man way. The hawk suddenly fell before Jason, twitching and gasping as it died, and he knew the time to strike was now. Jason leapt on the bear, his arms trying to crush him, but not able to find purchase. He sank his teeth into the bear's throat, and for a moment he was afraid that he wouldn't make it through all that thick fur. The bear tried to bring its claws to bear, but as the wolf worried at it with its fangs, he was rewarded with a mouthful of hot blood. The bear kept trying to rake him with those claws, but its movements were becoming less coordinated. When it fell, the whole room shook with the sound of thunder, and Jason rolled off it as it lay still. "Bravo! Bravo!" cried the coyote, clapping its paws together in celebration. "Well fought, young wolf. Well fought." Jason took a step towards him, but suddenly he was falling. It was as if a whirlpool had opened up beneath him, and he was being sucked into it. Jason thrashed and snarled, trying to get his balance, but he was powerless against the pull as it flung him down into the depths of some strange and terrible abyss. He came to in the empty clearing where the house had been, and that was where he had found his friends. Wiley rewound the tape, not quite sure what to make of it. So this strange man offered to play a game, and then he changed you three into animals. Jason nodded, looking like one of those birds that dips its head into water. "I picked Fang, so I was the wolf. The game wasn't fair. We didn't know what we were doing, but I still killed Moody. I killed both of them because I had been the one to approach the house first. I killed them when I agreed to play the game. It's my fault. I'm a murderer." Wiley wasn't so sure, but it was hard to argue with the evidence. The video showed Jason dropping the camera, and then suddenly there was a lot of snarling and screeching. Wiley heard the animals fighting, but he heard something else too. Something was laughing, really having a good belly chuckle, and it sounded like a hyena. He couldn't see it. It was all lost amongst the carpet. But suddenly the carpet had turned into grass, and the camera was lying outside in the midday sun. Someone got up. Someone sobbed and moaned out in negation, and then they walked away. That was where the video ended. In the end, Jason was sent for psychiatric evaluation, and the whole thing was chalked up to a drug-induced episode. Jason and his friends were drugged by an old man in the woods, and while under the influence of an unknown substance, a substance that didn't show up in any toxicology screening, they killed each other. Blood was found on Jason, blood belonging to Marshall Moody, but blood from the fingernails of Moody was determined to belong to Kay Dillon, which really helped push the narrative that Detective Wiley was working with. He told the press to report an old man in the woods who was drugging people, and pushed the stranger danger talks a little harder that year on school visits. After that day, the tape he took from Jason Weeks was never seen again, but Wiley believed that the boys had run up against something they weren't prepared for. When John McEnroe had led the extermination of the Native Americans that dwelt on the land, he had angered something that he wasn't prepared for either. Wiley's grandmother had liked to tell stories about Coyote, the trickster god, who could be as fierce as he was cunning when he needed to be. Wiley didn't think they would ever find an old man out there in the woods, but he didn't doubt others would find him. Coyote liked his games, especially when the players were people he saw as interlopers. McEnroe House remained a town legend, and Wiley had little doubt that those foolish enough to enter would be presented with the same game these boys had been given. Wiley shuddered to think how the next challenge might go when Coyote needed more amusement.